I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners. As custodians, they've maintained an unbroken connection to their land, traditions, languages and knowledge systems for tens of thousands of years. And I think they probably never needed to contemplate the notions of human extinction, but certainly understood the principles of non-maleficence or do no harm. So the Aboriginal peoples have been living on this land for more than 65,000 years and recognise they're the oldest continuous living culture. So these are the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people. And on behalf of the University of Queensland, I pay respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue that cultural and spiritual connection to country. Now, we just want to recognise a few people. Obviously, you're here for the Philip Walker lecture, a dear friend and colleague. I just want to acknowledge his close friend, Doug Cavey, who's at the front here, who's here with his wife, Lisa, who's going to remind us a bit about this brilliant individual, and he'll speak to you shortly. I'd also like to welcome and acknowledge some VIP guests. Ms. Lexi Press, Phil's wife, and we've got Professor Danny Liu, the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Health and Medicine and Biomedical Sciences, here with his partner Brooke, and Professor Susan Lemire, who is a good friend of our speaker this evening, who's a Pro Vice-Chancellor also at the UQ, and Professor Mark Smithers, the previous main Professor of Surgery, and also, of course, our main guest and speaker, Professor Dominic Wilkinson, our guest speaker joining us tonight from the Jesus College in Oxford. And I'm going to ask Bernadette Richards to introduce him formally to you. I'd also like to welcome students, colleagues, friends, guests, all of you here this evening. Now, just to kick off, I'm going to ask Associate Professor Doug Cavey. He's a renowned vascular surgeon, previous UQ Senate member, and more importantly, a colleague and close friend of the Phil Walker family. Doug, could I invite you to the lectern to tell us a little bit about this extraordinary individual?
Thanks very much. I hasten to add that Owen, who's the President of the College of Surgeons at the moment and the Professor of Surgery, I remember him as our medical student. So I'm getting old. I don't see you getting old at all, Owen. When I walked into the room, it's ridiculous. Philip Walker was an academic vascular surgeon. He was an outstanding clinician and operator and researcher and teacher and leader and a friend to everybody. He was the Professor of Surgery at UQ and the head of discipline. He trained at the University of Sydney in general surgery. To become a vascular surgeon in the 80s, you had to train in general surgery. He did his fellowship in 1988 and then did a couple of years at PA Hospital, Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney, and then moved on to Stanford University Medical Centre, where he did a fellowship in 1991, which is when I met Phil. Phil was undertaking a fellowship in Northern California at Stanford, and I was doing my post-general surgery vascular fellowship at Harvey UCLA Medical Centre in Los Angeles. And we hadn't met because we were from different cities in Australia. But we met, and I met Lexi, his wife, with Phil in the ballroom of the Chicago Hilton in 1990 at a function, a black tie function, and Phil was wearing a pink Hawaiian shirt and a feather boa. And everybody had a cocktail except for Phil, who had an enormous beer. So I thought, it was an interesting sort of guy, and he was an interesting sort of guy. He was enormous fun to be with, and we spent 30 years as friends and colleagues. When Phil was at Stanford, he and Michael Dake, who's a radiologist, produced and deployed the first thoracic aortic stent graft in a human ever in the world for an aortic aneurysm. So it was a a milestone. It was an enormous innovation and leap forward. And that's really why Phil and I went to the United States in the early 90s, was to learn. We'd trained in open vascular surgery, and we had to learn this new technology of endovascular surgery, which has really replaced most open vascular surgery now. When Phil returned in 92, I came back in 93 to the Royal Brisbane at the university. We shared an office and a consulting room, an operating room, and we needed each other to do these slightly odd operations involving wires and stents and balloons, and we saved each other numerous times. We had a wonderful working relationship, became very good friends. We've shared too many hotel rooms over the years going to international meetings, and I'm ashamed to say that on one occasion in New Orleans we shared the bed because the hotel was full to overflowing. To finish with, I ask you all, why is there an ethics lecture endowed by a surgeon? And I discussed this with our esteemed lecturer earlier, and I asked how many surgical lectures were endowed by ethicists, and he couldn't think of any, and he thought there might be a disparity in income allowing for endowment, and that may be but it's not the only reason. Phil thought very deeply about things. He was very much involved in innovation vascular surgery, which requires an enormous amount of confidence on the part of the practitioner. It also requires an enormous amount of trust on behalf of the patients. And there are deep moral and ethical implications to that process. Phil was very much aware of the inequality of access to medical care in Australia and the world, and that troubled him. And when Phil became unwell in his late 40s, he had obvious medical problems that required ethical and moral decisions towards the end of his life, which he wrote about and published. He dealt with all these difficult issues, and at the peak of his career at age 57, he died of prostate cancer nearly 11 years ago. I'm thrilled that Lexi's here. Phil's left an enormous legacy. He's left an enormous amount of money to the College of Surgeons, the ANZ-SVS, the University, the Royal Brisbane Foundation, and for this lecture. And I thank you for listening.
So there's one other very important person who is, I'm going to introduce you now, who is co-hosting this event with me, and that's Associate Professor Bernadette Richards, and she wears many hats within the university. So to get this right, she's the Associate Professor of Medical Ethics and Professionalism. She's also the theme lead, kind, compassionate professional, and director of high degree research students, which is a phenomenally important role in the Faculty of Medicine. So I'm going to ask Bernadette to introduce her friend and colleague, our guest speaker this evening, Professor Dominic Wilkinson. So Bernadette, if you could come to the lectern.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. I may wear many hats, but I cannot hold a candle to our speaker this evening. We were trying to work out earlier where and when we'd first met. It was in Adelaide. I thought it was 20 years ago, but thankfully it was only 15, so it wasn't that long ago after all. Dominic really stands for everything that I believe Phil Walker, who I never had the privilege of meeting, was looking for in this legacy. Dominic is a fine clinician, very well respected, and the work that he does academically, his scholarship, is something that I am in awe of myself. It is thoughtful, it is thought-provoking, and it really asks us to pause and think about many things. Besides all of that, Dominic is a very fine human being. Last time I saw him, he swept up to meet me on his bicycle in the snow in Oxford, and I had the great honour of having lunch there at the college, and he entertained me and regaled me with many tales, and in his usual friendly and open manner. So without further ado, I would like to ask Dominic to speak to us this evening.
Well, thank you, Bernadette. And thank you to all the people who've made this evening possible. It's a great privilege to be here to give this lecture in honour of Phil Walker. He sounds like an extraordinary person, and I'm sorry I didn't get to meet him either. But I'll hope to do credit to his bequest. Well, we'll see how I go. You can judge that. So I'm very impressed to see so many of you here. I did my very best to design something that sounded totally miserable and depressing. It's a little bit of an occupational hazard in ethics that we tend to be interested in some of the kind of grimmer questions in life. So that's what I'm going to do to get into, but I'm going to start by engaging you with some questions. So although you've been told to turn off your phones, I'm going to get you to dig them out again. Hopefully you just turned them on silent, and you're going to do some Slido quizzes. We'll see what you think. So you can either point it at the QR code. There's one over in that corner if it's closer, or you can just go to slido.com and enter the cryptic code there. I do normally create a meaningful password, but I didn't manage to do so. It's 2439551. Often I keep it hidden until people have voted, so you can't just follow what everybody else has done. But we'll see. I can see that 29 of you have voted. 33. Can we get up to 40? Oh, brilliant. Amazing. Fantastic. You're all very, very quick with your thumbs. Brilliant. Okay. So that's very interesting. Good. Next question. So that was an easy one. Would it be good or bad for humans to become extinct? So there's a bit of humming and chin stroking going on. Oh, you can kind of see that it's all changing. It's very exciting. I never know quite what people are going to do with these. There's lots of votes for it would be neither good nor bad. Interesting. Okay, one more question, and then I'll start saying some things. Is the possibility of human extinction relevant to medical ethics? Well, it's nice that some of you think so. I'm inclined to think so. Maybe I'll convince the one or two of you who say no by the end of this lecture. Okay, good. So before I begin, a little bit of context. Medical ethics is a discipline at the boundary of science, medicine, and the humanities. Somebody asked me earlier, how do you do research in medical ethics? Well, maybe this lecture will answer that. Much work in medical ethics, indeed much of my own work, starts from practice. It takes problems in medical care and tries to help think through the ethical problems that are raised. It may draw on philosophical techniques, concepts, and analysis. But some work goes in the opposite direction. It starts from philosophical analysis and theory and looks at what the implications of that thinking would be for practice. So over the last year, I've been working on a book based on the work of a great Oxford philosopher I suspect most of you have never heard of, called Derek Parfit. Parfit wrote a small number of papers and books across his lifetime that have had a massive impact on applied ethics. This is Derek. And the book that I'm working on, might appear in the next couple of years, takes the reader on a set of philosophical journeys exploring the implications of this philosophical work for medicine and medical ethics. And it includes a chapter based on Parfit's work on population ethics. And so I thought for this lecture, I draw on that to take you on a journey into a topic that perhaps you haven't thought about or would rather not think about. This is the short summary of what I'm going to cover in the next 40 minutes. If you drop off or tune out, but you just listen to this bit, then you won't have missed anything. You can also, if you're inclined, there's a QR code there to the text of what I'm about to say. So if you miss a bit or you're super interested, want to come back and think about it again, work out where I went wrong, it's entirely possible, then you're welcome to have a read of it later. I'll have another link to that at the end. So what I'm going to argue that extinction is relevant to medical ethics. You all think that it is anyway, so that's a bit wasted. But it's relevant because it's connected to the morality of adding to the population. It's also important because of the vast numbers of potential lives that are at stake. I'm going to suggest that there are three possible views about extinction. Extinction would be good, would be neutral, or that it would be bad. Whichever of these we hold have very significant implications for medical ethics. And I'm going to defend the latter view, that it would be very bad. I think the most plausible view is that it would be extremely bad, but there's a danger. Once we recognize that it's morally important to avoid extinction, the worry is that it dominates moral considerations. It might be the most pressing priority, more important than alleviating poverty, ending conflicts, even curing disease. At the end of the lecture, I'm going to suggest one potential way of avoiding this problem that recognizes the importance for medical ethics of preventing extinction, but allows us to give weight to some other pressing moral priorities. So, to start with, an empirical question, a measurable question. How likely is extinction? One way of representing this is given by the so-called doomsday clock. As of 2025, the view of the non-profit organization, the Bureau Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, is that we're at 89 seconds to midnight. Obviously, this is not a literal estimate of the proximity of extinction, otherwise this lecture will be very short. It imaginatively captures the relative danger of an extinction event compared with previous eras. A different era has been taken by thinkers like the Australian philosopher Toby Ord, with whom I shared an office when I was doing my PhD. In his excellent book, also not super cheerful, called The Precipice, but which I thoroughly recommend, he attempts to evaluate different sources of evidence, different types of threats, and plausible estimates about risk. There are two broad types of extinction risk. There are natural risks, asteroids, supervolcanoes. Most of these are thought to be fairly small. Some estimate these as about 1 in a million per century, or puts them together about 1 in 10,000 per century. But then there are human-related risks, and AI-engineered pathogens dominate these. His overall estimate is about 1 in 6 risk of extinction in the next century, most of which is due to us, anthropogenic. There are, of course, a range of estimates. At the low end, some put it around 5%, mid-range 5 to 15%, higher estimates like Toby's, but actually the precise number doesn't matter. Whether we think that there's a 1 in 100 or a 1 in 5 chance, potentially the implications are the same. Most of you said 1 in 100, some of you said 1 in 1,000. Again, I don't think it matters when we recognize that extinction matters. The numbers involved might make the chance less relevant. Does extinction actually matter? It's estimated that 99% of all species that have ever existed on Earth have become extinct. One estimate suggests that 5 billion species on Earth have become extinct. Does that matter? We might ask whether it matters for the dodo that it is extinct. One point that we should separate the process of becoming extinct from extinction itself. Many extinction processes, hunting by humans, introduction of competing species, habitat loss, those are bad for the last of the species who suffer in the process. Becoming extinct is obviously bad. But when we think about being extinct, our answer is different. Extinction is not bad for the dodo. There are no dodos who suffer or who are badly off because they don't exist. If we think it's bad, we must be because dodo extinction is bad for someone else, bad for us because we quite like to see one, or bad for other creatures who'd like to eat one, or in the somewhere else in the food chain. Perhaps it's just bad simpliciter. We might think that it's be good that dodos exist in the universe, conversely bad that dodos do not exist. It's in this way that the ethics of extinction is intimately connected to the ethics of existence. The question is it good for people or conscious entities to come into existence? Is it bad if they don't exist? So extinction is therefore relevant to medical ethics in two ways. First, our answers about the ethics of extinction and existence are obviously relevant to reproductive policy. They have direct impact on some very central medical ethical questions, the ethics of ending a life in the womb, preventing conception, or alternatively, of artificially reproducing. But also, as I will argue, the scale of extinction potentially means that it has a much broader relevance. It may overshadow most other ethical issues. I'll return to that. Existence. There are conceivably three different possible views. We might think that coming into existence is a bad thing, and therefore extinction would be good. We might think that both coming into existence and extinction are morally neutral. Most of you seem to be on the fence. Or we might think that generally coming into existence is a good thing and therefore extinction would be bad. I don't think there's any other possibilities, but it's just one of these. So let's talk about these in turn. Would extinction be good? Well, the first answer is that actually it would be very good if humankind were to become extinct. This view, which you might or might not have encountered, is sometimes called antinatalism. It's not a very popular view, but it has been defended by famously the South African philosopher David Benatar in his provocative but very intriguing book, Better Never to Have Been. He has different arguments in favour of his view. One of the arguments is based on what we could call well-being pessimism. Although most people, most of the time, think that our lives are worth living, their lives are worth living, Benatar thinks they are mistaken. According to Benatar, our lives are much worse than we think. And there's a series of evolved biases that just lead us to ignore reality. That includes Pollyannaism, a tendency to selective memory, unreasonable optimism, adaptation, like a frog being slowly boiled, and our tendency to compare our lot with others. Other people are much worse off than we are, so we must be okay. Of course, if he's right that most people's lives are actually not worth living, then potentially it is bad to have children. It would be better if no more children came into the world. But there's a second, more important argument for Benatar. He pointed out what he and other philosophers have observed is an ethical asymmetry. One form of asymmetry in ethics that has fairly widespread intuitive support is a harm-benefit asymmetry. The idea is that it's more morally important to prevent or alleviate harms than it is to cause a benefit of similar magnitude. The asymmetry of existence is related to this, but it's stronger, it's deeper. If we bring someone into existence, we can anticipate that in their life there'll be both good and bad elements. Take our hypothetical dodo. If the dodo is born, it will have some pleasant positive experiences, some negative unpleasant ones. If we're thinking about life for the dodo, we might want to weigh up the good against the bad, work out which is greater. But if we don't bring the dodo into existence, our evaluation is different. It's good that the dodo doesn't have any negative experiences. The absence of pain is a good thing. On the other hand, their lack of positive things is not bad. There's no dodo who's deprived of these. So the argument goes, when we compare existence with non-existence, the latter, non-existence, is always better. Because for existence, we have to weigh up both good and bad, and for non-existence, it's always positive, because it avoids the negative things in life. So simplistically, if the dodo exists, we have the bad minus the good. Is it positive? If the dodo doesn't exist, it's good that they don't suffer minus nothing. So it's net positive when somebody doesn't exist. This is the asymmetry. I can hear some of you not very impressed by this philosophical sophistry, but that's the argument. If we hold an antinatalist view, it's immediately clear that this would have some implications for medical decisions. Potentially, it would support decisions designed to suppress reproduction. We might think of China's infamous one-child policy, but now make it a no-child policy. Perhaps we put contraception in the water supply, coerce women to end their pregnancies, ban fertility treatment, etc. Benatar famously downplayed these implications. He suggested that even if it would be better that no one had children, basic human rights and liberties, rights to procreation, bodily autonomy, all of these kind of important ethical principles would mean that the sort of no-child policy like the one I've described would clearly be unethical. So philosophically, it might be bad, but we're not going to go about putting contraceptives in the water supply. But I think Benatar's too quick here. Although liberty is important, there's another liberal principle, the so-called harm principle, that states are justified in restricting freedom to prevent harm to others. Think of a certain pandemic. For example, parents are not generally thought to be free to cause significant harm to their children. But if, of course, we harm our children by bringing them into existence, then maybe we should stop parents from doing that. And the scale of the problem is enormous. There are 140 million births worldwide a year. That means, on Benatar's view, 140 million people are harmed by reproductive decisions every year. Perhaps fortunately, I think that the antinatalist arguments don't succeed. I tend to be much more glass half full than Benatar. I don't share his view about our lives. Although there are doubtless many in our world whose lives are very challenging, there are plenty who are happy to be alive. And although Benatar might think that I and others are mistaken to be so positive, there's a more important principle, which is that we should be pluralist, respecting the range of views about this. We shouldn't impose a view that most people don't share. And even if there are many in our current world with difficult lives, there have been some fundamental improvements over time. Think of life expectancy, physical health, leisure time, basic freedoms, reduction in the proportion of the world in extreme poverty. So even if it's bad now, there's at least the potential that lives will continue to improve. So I don't think we should be welfare pessimists. At least we shouldn't incorporate such pessimism into our ethical policy. But I think there's also reason to reject the philosophical asymmetry. The key claim was that the absence of pain is good even if there is no one who's saved from pain. If our dodo doesn't exist, we can at least be glad that the hypothetical dodo doesn't suffer. But if we think that, it's not clear to me why we shouldn't also be drawn to the opposite conclusion. The absence of pleasure is in one way bad, even if there is no one who misses out on it. Although our dodo doesn't exist, we can be sad that the hypothetical dodo does not experience whatever it is that makes dodos happy. Okay, so if both future bads and future goods matter, then we don't have, I think, a strong reason to favour non-existence or extinction. One clear possibility, if we reject the asymmetrical view of the future, is that goods and bads in future lives cancel each other out. Then we may be led to a neutral view. The idea of being neutral about bringing people into existence has some intuitive plausibility. It's been defended by the US libertarian philosopher Jan Narveson. Narveson memorably captured the idea in a slogan that he wrote in the early 1970s. On his view, it definitely matters morally when we make existing people better off, but, so Narveson claims, it doesn't matter at all if we create new people who would be happy. This fits with many people's views about having children. On a widespread view, we have moral obligations to our children. It's good to make your existing children happy. That may be very morally important, but there's no obligation to have children. No one acts wrongly by deciding to remain childless. Here's an analogy for the neutral view. Imagine that I'm feeling particularly generous and decide to benefit all of those who made the right decision to come to this lecture by putting some money in your existing bank accounts. That would be very good. I'm sure you'll all agree. You're probably now happy that you came to this lecture. But imagine I decide on a different form of generosity. Instead of giving you money, I decide that I will open for you a new empty account. In this analogy, new lives are just like new blank accounts. Filling the accounts once they're there may be positive, but just creating a new account or new lives is neutral. What are the implications of this view? Of course, if we're neutral about bringing people into the world, we would also be neutral about not bringing people into the world. And then we wouldn't have to worry about the risk of human extinction. We need not worry about climate change or nuclear war. Perhaps that would be a relief. But it might come at a cost. Even if we knew that the future of humanity were extremely bright, that there were trillions of extremely happy lives ahead, on this view, we need not worry if we knew that instead this was the last human generation. If we embrace this view, it also implies neutrality or indifference about reproductive technologies. It suggests that there's no moral reason to help couples to avoid having children with severe genetic disease. Those are future lives, so we don't have to think it's a morally bad thing if somebody brings a child into the world with severe disability. There's no reason to support prenatal screening. Again, these are future people. We should be neutral about them. It also suggests a much more radically liberal view. We should be neutral about gene editing or cloning. Our existing laws are misplaced because these technologies mean that different people exist, and we should be ethically neutral about those. Perhaps it's not a surprise if I suggest that we should reject this second view too. The neutral view. One point worth noting is that even if we set aside the difficult question about the morality of bringing people into existence, we still have strong reasons to want to avoid many existential threats, climate change, pandemics, nuclear war, etc., because they will be bad for existing people. Even if we thought that it would not be bad if there were no future humans, the process of humans becoming extinct would likely cause enormous amounts of suffering. Recall, I distinguished becoming extinct from being extinct. Even if we thought being extinct was neutral, becoming extinct would still be bad. We'd still have some reasons to try and avoid climate change and nuclear war. But I think that we should also not be neutral about future lives. If we know that a child that we conceive would have a happy life, one that they would value, that gives us a reason, a moral reason to bring them into the world. Of course, it doesn't mean that we're obliged to do so. There are many morally good things that we can do in our lives. We have to choose between them because we can't do them all, and also because pursuing them may come at the cost of our own well-being. There are, of course, important questions about the environmental impact of human lives, about the sustainability of the human population, and those may give us reason to choose individually not to reproduce or to limit the number of children that we have. But whatever we think the right number is for the population, we shouldn't be neutral about it. And if we're not neutral, and we don't think that extinction would be good, that only leaves one possibility. I've already suggested, and I don't imagine that any of you will disagree, that becoming extinct would be extremely bad. Unless it was instantaneous, it would be associated with much suffering for existing people. And even if it were instantaneous and without warning, for example, a sudden colossal solar storm, extinction would be bad because future valuable lives would not occur. It's not that extinction would be bad for those future people. They would never exist, just like extinction is not bad for the dodo. But it would nevertheless be bad because of all the good things in those lives that would not happen. So this connects with an argument that Derek Parfit referred to, or a principle that he referred to as the wide principle. We can benefit people in one of two ways, he said. We can benefit them in what he called a narrow way by making them better off than they would have otherwise been. But we can also benefit people in a different, wider way by bringing it about that they come into existence. We could call all this the existence view. And, or so I contend, and Parfit thought that benefit also matters. It might not matter in exactly the same way. We might not weigh those benefits in the same way, but it matters. And if that benefit is not realized because humanity will not exist, that would be regrettable. it would be bad. It's worth highlighting one situation in which extinction wouldn't be bad. I mentioned earlier that perhaps 5 billion species have become extinct over the history of our planet. But the end of a species doesn't itself give us reason to regret. One of the key ways in which species extinction occurs is by being overtaken or replaced by another species. The Neanderthals became extinct through, among other factors, competition and interbreeding with early humans. Then the loss of Neanderthal lives was balanced with a gain in human lives. In the same way, humans might become extinct by transforming into another post-human species. Whether that's bad or good will depend on the nature of those future lives. Imagine that Homo sapiens is replaced by an equal number of Homo superior, living lives that are happier, more fulfilling. There wouldn't be anything regrettable about that particular form of human extinction. But setting that aside, what are the implications of this view about extinction? Well, one possibility is that rather than being antinatalists, we should then find ourselves as pronatalists. I don't know if you've encountered the modern form of pronatalism. This is a movement that seems to be having a political moment in the US. It's particularly associated with political and religious conservatism. That particular movement is concerned not with the survival of humanity, but with the survival of particular types of humans. They're concerned about low birth rates, aging populations, demographic and economic threats, particularly to those currently alive and to their financial well-being, rather than caring abstractly about future lives. And then they're not advocates of reproduction in general, but focused on reproduction of those from particular backgrounds. For example, they quite like the idea that liberals have falling birth rates and may breed themselves out of political contention. So we should distinguish the ethical implications of selective pronatalism, generally misconceived, often quite dystopian, quite horrible, from the more general ethical implications of what I've called the existence view. This view, that bringing people into existence is a good thing, I've got more there, yes, might be thought to have some obvious medical ethical implications. For one thing, perhaps it gives us a reason to oppose or restrict access to abortion or contraception. That would clearly please some of the selective pronatalists from the political right. But recall, when I was talking about the antinatalist view, I mentioned Benatar's argument that even if existence is bad, we have to balance that with the importance of certain key liberties. I didn't think that argument worked for antinatalism, and I ended up rejecting antinatalism anyway. But it is clearly relevant here. If we think that bringing people into existence is a good thing, but we also think that individual freedom about reproductive decisions is important, then policymakers might have reason to provide incentives for individuals or couples to reproduce, but unless it were necessary to prevent human extinction, they wouldn't have reason to restrict important reproductive rights. Perhaps more significantly, this might change the way that we think about the importance of fertility and fertility treatment. Societies like the UK and Australia provide limited publicly funded fertility treatment. It's seen as less important than other health priorities. From a health economic point of view, it's usually justified in terms of the well-being of prospective parents. So they're weighing up the happiness of those with infertility of various kinds. But if we think that it's independently a good thing to bring somebody into the world, that may suggest that we can and should be more generous in how we think about fertility treatment. One challenging implication of the view that it's morally good to bring new people into existence is a theoretical implication that applies whenever we think about very large future populations. Basically, the idea is this, that future populations could be good in one of two different ways. The first is in terms of quality. It's good for the people who exist to be happy, and the people who live in the future could be happier, have more positive lives. The second is in terms of quantity. It's good to bring people into existence, and there could be more people alive having lives that are worth living. When he first started exploring population ethics, Derek Parfit pointed out that quality and quantity of future lives could compete. So in theory, instead of having a large population, say 8 billion people all living extremely happy lives, it would be better to have a much, much, much larger population, say a gazillion people, all living lives that are only barely worth living. Quality and quantity, they just compete. If you've got enough quantity, it could mean that that would be a better world. Parfit called this the repugnant conclusion. As the name suggests, he didn't think this was very attractive and thought it was a problem for philosophical theory. There's been a lot of philosophical ink spilt discussing the repugnant conclusion, and I'm not going to discuss it in much more detail tonight. I'm interested in focusing on another implication of the existence view, one that I think is directly related to extinction and might be practically of more importance than the repugnant conclusion. First, for those of you who are dropping off, I'm going to get you to wake up again. I've got one more Slido survey for you. If there isn't a sentinel event, so absent some kind of catastrophe, how many human lives does the future hold? Obviously, at some point, humanity is going to end, but absent one of these kind of terrible things, supervolcanoes, global pandemic, etc., how many human lives does the future hold? Okay, so we've got lots of votes for 10 billion or 100 billion, trillion, a few for a gazillion. Okay, lots. Very, very good. Well, estimates of how long our species will last depend on what we're basing that estimate on. Are we basing it on how long humans have been around? That's around 300,000 years. Basing it on other great apes and how long they typically have lasted across the lifetime of our planet, or the average duration of mammalian species. It depends on how many lives we think the Earth can support, and whether we think that in the future humanity will remain confined to Earth or will expand within the solar system, or maybe whether we'll be uploaded and we'll have digital consciousness. To pick some pretty conservative numbers, if confined to Earth and we don't become extinct, there's the potential for about 11 billion lives per century. That makes 110 billion lives in the next 1,000 years. If we survive for 1,000 years, that means that potentially as many new people will exist as have ever existed. If humans live for 87,000 years, and that's a conservative estimate for how long humankind might last, that means 1 trillion lives, 1 by 10 to the power 12. I don't know about you, but my brain just doesn't cope with numbers this large. So let me help you understand what might be at stake. There have been about 1,800 seconds since the start of this talk. I know it feels like a long time. There are 1 million seconds in 12 days, 1 billion seconds in 30 years. 1 trillion is the number of seconds in 30,000 years. So just maybe, if humans become extinct, what's at stake is as many lives as the number of seconds since the end of the last ice age, since paintings like this were marked on the walls of the Chauvet Caves. I think it's obvious from the above that this matters. There's potentially a lot at stake in extinction and in existential risk. It's relatively recently in human history that some of the risks have increased. As mentioned at the start of this talk, a number of the most pressing threats to human survival are anthropogenic. Toby Ord, in his recent book, refers to the precipice, this idea that we are at a crucial point in human history when we're exposed to the greatest risk and are in danger of falling off the cliff. It's also only relatively recently that the significance of this problem has been recognized. Parfit, in some of his writing, referred to this as one of the most important moral priorities, And in the last decade, this has inspired some writers and activists, for example, the philosopher Will MacAskill, to develop and promote a movement called longtermism that focuses very explicitly on the importance of protecting the future. Some attention to the long term of our planet and our species seems very sensible. We're all acutely aware of how short-term political thinking and decision-making can be. It's no bad thing to have some people thinking seriously about and caring about the very long-term consequences of our choices. But there's a worry, and this is how we get back to the relevance for medical ethics. One of the key questions in medicine and in society more generally is how to allocate our limited resources. There are competing priorities for our health budgets, whether that's aged care, mental health, cancer treatment, vascular disease, genetic diseases, care of premature newborn infants. There are also different things that treatments or chancellors must choose between in allocating government spending. Think of education, infrastructure, defence, healthcare. And of course, there are enormous pressing priorities in our world. For example, there are 160,000 people who die in armed conflicts in an average year. Recent years, sadly, have been higher than this. 1.5 million children die under the age of 5 from vaccine-preventable disease each year. Almost 700 million people live in extreme poverty. But those numbers, although large, are dwarfed by the number of future lives at stake in extinction threats. And so this leads to something that I have called the risky, repugnant conclusion. Others have referred to it as a kind of tyranny of the future. The worry is that if we take seriously the threat of extinction, this will overshadow or outweigh many of the priorities of our time. It may be important to spend our budgets on preventing or mitigating existential risk. It may be more important to do that than to spend it on international aid. It may be better to invest in AI safety initiatives than in cancer research. Perhaps provocatively, it would be better to fund research into asteroid deflection than into vaccines for malaria. How might we respond to this challenge? Well, one possibility is we could bite the bullet. Once we step back and recognize what's at stake, we may realize that many of the things that we think of as important in our current world are utterly insignificant compared with the potential value that lies in humanity's future. We should radically rethink what is important. Related to this, perhaps the bullet won't be as difficult or unpleasant tasting as we think. We may reflect that some current priorities would also address potential existential threats. Investing in those would benefit people in the present and the future. One obvious example might be pandemic prevention efforts or work to mitigate anthropogenic climate change. These seem important and a good thing to pursue, but it would be a mistake to assume that the priorities of the present and the future coincide. There are many things that are current priorities that do not appear related to existential threat, and vice versa. If we take seriously the risk and the importance of extinction, some things will have to give. Are there ways to avoid this? To kind of metaphorically defend ourselves from a kind of philosophical asteroid strike? The danger that the needs of the future might defeat the needs of the present. Well, here are a number of possibilities that we might suggest that you might have in mind, but which I think are not ultimately successful. First, we might give less weight to interventions for existential threat because the threats are unlikely or the investment in interventions is not very likely to be successful. But our standard way of factoring uncertainty into decision-making is to combine the chance of something happening with the value of it occurring into an estimate of expected value. And the worry is that, as I suggested in my risky, repugnant conclusion argument, even if the probabilities are tiny, the value of future lives is so vast that it outweighs our much more immediate, much more likely concerns. Here's another possibility. We could apply kind of discounting to future lives. So although there are billions or trillions of lives in the future, the importance of those lives diminishes the further in the future they lie. Such discounting is commonly incorporated into economic models based on patterns of preferences. But there are several problems with this as an ethical argument. One is, although it's very clear that we prefer goods and benefits in the present over those in the future, it's far from clear that we ought to do so. Such preferences potentially arise from bias. Just as the value of someone's life is not diminished by physical distance, for example, philosophers like Peter Singer have argued persuasively that it's morally just as important if a child is dying on the other side of the world as if they're dying in our own town, so too the value of a life is not reduced by mere separation in time. Third, a related move might be to suggest that we give preferential treatment to those in our present world because they're part of our current political and moral community. But again, although it's clear that we have such preferences and we're inclined to give preferential treatment to those here and now, it's much less clear that we're justified in doing so. Part of the idea of the long-termist movement is to suggest that our ignoring the needs of those who might exist in the future is a serious ethical mistake. It's a kind of discrimination. It's a kind of futurism. The last strategy that we might adopt addresses specifically the practical problem of decision-making in the face of very large values and tiny probabilities. Since the 18th century, some mathematicians have recognized that when the stakes are very high, the decision theory recommends what seems like recklessness, investing all we have on tiny, tiny probabilities. So we might think that this sort of investment in preventing existential risk is just like that we're justified in ignoring very small probabilities, perhaps less than 1 million, for example. Whether that's the right thing to do is debatable. It is potentially wrong to ignore very small probabilities when the stakes are so high. But as I alluded at the start of the talk, actually, the risk of extinction in the next century is not necessarily of that magnitude. Most people think that it's significantly more than 1 in 1 million. It might be 5 or 10%, or 1 in 6, as Ord suggests. In that case, even if we ignore small probabilities, we can't ignore extinction risk. It isn't my aim in this talk to provide a definitive answer to this question. I'm not sure that I have one. But here's my proposal for how we should think about weighing up existential risk and the value of human future lives against some very pressing priorities for our world. And I'm going to draw on another piece of Derek Parfit's philosophy. For today, I'll just give you a very brief outline of the idea and how it might apply to the problem. Although Parfit was often viewed as a utilitarian, in part of his work, he defended a view that was quite different. In a lecture he gave in the mid-90s, Parfit drew on a thought experiment originally suggested by the American philosopher Tom Nagel. Nagel asked us to imagine a couple who have 2 children. One of their children is happy and healthy, the other has a painful disability. The parents are contemplating 2 options. The first option is to change jobs, move house to the city. That would be better for their disabled child, since that child could then access specialist healthcare, therapies, specialist schooling. Or they could move to a location on the edge of the city. If they do that, lifestyle, sporting and schooling opportunities would be significantly better for their healthy child. Perhaps we imagine that the healthy child is a budding Olympic equestrian. For the purposes of our thought experiment, we're supposed to assume the following. The parents know that the advantage, the gain for the healthy child of moving to the suburb is significantly more than the gain for the disabled child of moving to the city. What should the parents do? Well, one potential response is that the parents should move to the city. In doing so, they will be choosing the less good option. The difference they will make is less. But I think there's a very strong intuitive sense that potentially they should nevertheless do this. One reason that might be given might relate to fairness or equity. But Parfit's explanation was different. He suggested that the reason to help the second child in preference was because it's more morally important to help people the worse off they are to start off with. This view, which he called the priority view, sometimes also called prioritarianism, was that we shouldn't simply think about how we can do the most good, but also about who are the beneficiaries. Benefits to people who are very badly off to start with count for more. A couple of very brief things to note about the priority view. By favouring those who are worse off, it will tend to lead to more equal distributions when we're allocating resources. But that isn't because equality itself is important. Second, although prioritarianism gives extra weight to those who are disadvantaged, it's not absolute. It won't always mean allocating to the worst off. If we can do much, much more good for someone who's not as badly off, potentially that benefit will outweigh the greater priority. How does this apply to existential risk? Well, my suggestion is that when we think about some of those who are recipients of our foreign aid budgets, those who'd benefit from research into malaria or vaccines to prevent early childhood infection, many of those are extremely badly off. We're justified in giving extra priority to those individuals, and our ethical reason for doing so is not mere bias for the present or parochialism. But this sort of ethical reason, this priority, doesn't apply to the future people who might not exist if humankind becomes extinct. They're not badly off because they don't exist, just like the hypothetical dodo that I referred to earlier. Although I think this helps, it doesn't mean that we can ignore the importance of existential risk. And because the sort of prioritarianism that I'm drawing on is not absolute, it's still possible that very, very large numbers of good lives in the future would mean significant sacrifices in the world today. Okay, so where have we got to? Although extinction does not feature in textbooks or teaching about medical ethics, I've suggested in this talk that extinction is highly relevant. Indeed, it may overshadow many other considerations. That's firstly because the ethics of extinction, the ethics of existence, reproduction are intimately connected. This is clearly relevant to a whole lot of very familiar questions in medical ethics. Secondly, it's because the number of lives involved are so high. That doesn't matter if we're neutral about future lives, because then we'll be neutral about an event or choice, no matter whether it would prevent the existence of one unhappy person or a trillion happy people. But I've suggested that neutrality has some very serious and unpalatable implications. If we're neutral about future lives, we should be reproductive, complete libertarians. It would suggest that we should not care, do not need to care about decisions that affect future people. That strikes me as mistaken. If we're not neutral about future lives, there are only two possibilities, I've argued. If we're antinatalists, extinction would be a very good thing. There are billions of lives ahead, and we should actually seek to prevent them from coming into existence if we could do so. But that would have very radical, very unattractive implications for medical ethics. I also think it's mistaken. I think the most plausible view is that we should be positive about future lives, that it's good to bring people into existence if they will have lives worth living. And that has some direct implications for medical ethics. For example, it suggests that we rethink how we value fertility. But it also implies that extinction is a very serious threat, and it does itself carry the implications that I've described. The danger that it might swamp our other moral considerations mean that we should radically revise our priorities. I don't have a complete answer for what I've described as the risky, repugnant conclusion, but my suggestion is the following. First, there are some global priorities that are valuable to those who are currently alive and may help to avert existential risk. Those would obviously be sensible to pursue. For example, they may reduce the risk of major climate change, political unrest, antibiotic resistance, wars or weapons of mass destruction, bioterrorism, global pandemics. Second, there are things that we can do in our current world that would alleviate suffering and premature death for some of those facing extreme poverty, ill health and disease, even though they may not contribute to averting existential risk. I've suggested that we're justified in giving extra weight, priority to the needs of those who are currently very badly off. Lastly, that when we recognize the real ethical significance of extinction, it means that we probably should devote significant resources to that, and potentially at the expense of some other things that we currently think are important. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Don't go away, Dominic. I'm sure there may be some questions from the audience. So we've got a little bit of time, and here's your opportunity to ponder existentialism, and the rest. As surgeons, we can be a bit of concrete thinkers at time. But do anyone? Yes, there's a question over there. I'll give you the.
Hello. Thank you, Professor Wilkinson, for this very passionate defense of the existence of the human species. I have one little comment, which is that you just briefly mentioned environmental justice, and you've mentioned that your whole argument is very human-centric when we say existence is good or bad. I think it's really important to probably consider the Indigenous perspective. And I'm not Indigenous, so I cannot speak on behalf of any Aboriginal person here, and I apologize if that is inappropriate. But I think it is a good perspective that Indigenous people have that doesn't center the human in the country and in the land. So just as a bit of a thought. And then the second thing is that the latter part of your speech focused on resource allocation. And I am not an economist, but I wonder what your thoughts are on the current scarcity of resources and particularly inequality in allocation of and availability of resources, not only between different countries, but also between people in the same country.
Great, thank you. Two very good points. So one was, I've talked about human extinction and the badness of human extinction, but the arguments that I gave about whether it's good to exist don't apply specifically to humans. And indeed, I suggested that if humans became extinct, but there were other equally happy entities that existed and of an equal number, that would be not bad at all. I think there are really interesting questions and difficult questions about how we think about different types of lives, whether it's better for there to be more of some type, or if there are fewer of other types of lives. There's obviously a whole lot of value derivatively in diversity in life. So there are enormous environmental concerns which do coincide with these kind of concerns about extinction. I haven't, although I talked a lot about humans, I fully accept I should have been much broader in thinking about the existence of other species being good. The other point that you made was about allocation of resources and sort of existing allocation of resources, and the argument that I gave about thinking about priority for the worst off clearly has relevance for some of the challenges in terms of allocation of resources, whether it's within an individual state or city, country, globally. We a lot of the time don't, that those who are worse off don't have priority, and there are good reasons to do so. But I guess the challenge is that there are all these future lives that might be competing with some of those priorities, and the main aim was just to suggest that's a challenge for how we think about, not how we currently think about resource allocation, but maybe for how we should think about resource allocation. More questions?
There's a question over here. We've got you running, Natasha.
Sorry. Thanks very much for your talk, Professor Wilkinson. My name's Jared. I'm a paediatrician. I had a specific question about your views on antinatalism. My own intuitions probably mirror your conclusions on that. But I think within young people of childbearing age in particular, anthropogenic climate change is really often cited as a reason for not reproducing. In terms of that, do you think that there's a tipping point at which the risk of anthropogenic climate change occurring and causing an extinction-like event would be sufficient to tip your calculus in favour of an antinatalist view, that the risk of enduring and being present for an extinction-like event would be such a significant harm for those people that you would be more in favour of the antinatalist view that a lot of young people cite?
So I think we should distinguish the reasons that people might have to choose not to have children, and the sort of absolute view about whether coming into existence is good or bad. So the idea in Benatar's view is, even if you were living on a desert island, there were going to be no impact on the rest of the population, there were ample resources, it would be a bad thing to bring somebody into existence, because for the reasons that he gave. that's quite different from a view that in the world in which we currently live, the impact of extra lives, potentially especially extra lives in the global north rather than the global south, might have such negative deleterious effects on the environment that it would be better for them to refrain from childbearing. I don't think the young people who are not wanting to have kids at this moment in time think that it would be better if humanity necessarily became extinct. I think what they are very reasonably questioning is that maybe there's too many of us as it currently stands, and maybe also because a number of them are also influenced by effective altruism or related movements, thinking actually they could do more good in the world by doing something else with their lives. So that's I guess the distinction that I would make.
Question over here. Watch the edge of the podium.
Thanks. I loved your talk, really did. I don't know if you're aware that there's a fairly significant Aussie rules game this coming weekend with the mighty Brisbane Lions take on the dirty filth from Collingwood. And I was wondering if you could, say, extrapolate some of the ideas of Benatar to selective antinatalism for Collingwood supporters.
I think that takes me into very dangerous ethical terrain. I'm quite happy to, as you can kind of tell, to be a bit provocative and to say some fairly controversial things. But I think getting into football might be a step too far for me. But great question.
Thank you, Dominic. That was a great lecture. Something I wasn't expecting, but I'm really looking forward to telling all the residents about it in the ward round tomorrow, so they're going to love that. I wonder, is the key question actually what the quality of life of future generations will be? So I think there are potentially three scenarios where the lives of future humans are better than ours, they stay the same as ours, or they get really, really bad and not worth living. Because if you look at it in that way, then isn't the key question actually making sure that we make the quality of human life as good as possible, not to prevent extinction per se, because it may be that now an extinction event would be bad for humanity, but we might live in a world where we're all riddled with disease, we live in autocracies with no personal freedom and life isn't worth living. So isn't actually, that would come into your question about putting more resources into preventing extinction, but maybe we should be putting resources into the cancer treatments and the vaccines to make sure that human life is as good quality as possible. And that's actually the key point, not preventing extinction per se.
So it's an interesting point. I think if you care about future lives, then clearly, as I crudely suggested before, both quality and quantity are going to be relevant. And if it were the case that all of these lives would actually be so miserable, as Benatar thinks and they are already, then extinction wouldn't be a bad thing. Among those who are interested in long term, and there's some fairly fringe ideas in the long term movement, but there are lots of very bright thinkers. Certainly, Will McCaskill talks about it. One of the things that they're worried about are some particularly political changes that might very negatively affect future quality of life. So not particularly medical changes, but the idea that, I don't know, a kind of demagogue might take over a kind of major democracy take over the press, then that gets baked in such a way that actually it's not possible for a very, very long period of time, or potentially forever, to unwind that. So they're interested not purely in lives continuing, but also thinking about the quality of those lives. I think in terms of, as I alluded, it's very tempting for us to want to think that our current health priorities, like cancer treatment and vaccines and all of those things, will coincide with kind of preventing extinction threats. And sometimes they will, but quite often they won't. And it's not clear to me that prolonging, kind of extending lives, as medicine has worked very hard to do in the 7th and 8th and 9th decades, as important as that is to many in this room, certainly very important to me, that's if we had to weigh that against kind of averting an extinction threat, that we would give priority to that, for example.
Hi. My question is not a very medical one, I'm sorry, and maybe it's a bit ridiculous as well. But in your slide, when you were talking about calculating the total number of human lives that the future holds, you mentioned digital consciousnesses, and that kind of really threw me because it made me think, would it not be, if existence itself is a good thing, would it not be the most important thing we can do? Get a happy life, digitally upload it, and copy paste it times 1 trillion. Is that not more important than all the future actual lives?
So it's not a stupid question. It's a great question. And again, some of those who've been thinking about these questions about the far future have asked exactly that sort of question. I'm not sure what to think about digital consciousnesses and the value of them. But it's possible that if it were possible for the things that are valuable in our lives to occur in a digital space, then indeed that might be the way in which the most possible well-being would occur. There's another great thought experiment. I think I mentioned the US philosopher Robert Nozick earlier in the talk. So he had a philosophical thought experiment again in the sort of 1970s, long before the Matrix was ever imagined. So he imagined a machine he called the experience machine. And you could plug into the experience machine, and when you were plugged into the experience machine, you would experience the most happy, fulfilled life that you can imagine, but none of it would be real. And one of one of the key ideas that he was interested in thinking about was, what makes life go well? Is it just the cognitive experience of happiness or pleasure or having your preferences satisfied, or is there something more to that? So that's how we think about that question is going to be clearly relevant to whether we think it would be a good thing if there were 1 trillion digital lives, or whether actually it would be missing so much that would be much worse than another alternative.
Hello, thank you very much. People talk about utopias and the island and Soma and the eradication of suffering and pain. Would that be a good thing for as many people as absolutely possible? That not so much the length of life, but the quality of life, the relief of pain and suffering. I'm a psychiatrist, you see.
So again, great question. This connects to the thing that we were just talking about. So I mean, for many of the medics in the audience, as I say, I was going to take you on a philosophical journey. And one of the, I think, really important central bits of philosophy that's super relevant for medicine, super relevant for psychiatry, is this idea of well-being. What makes a life go well? Is it, so here just to kind of put this out there for you, here are 3 different possible views. One is that it's just about the sum of pleasure, subtracted from that the negative experiences. So if you just have the soma and just have this kind of blissful existence, then that would be the best possible life. Is it instead about the satisfaction of desires or preferences? That's a different, separate possible view that was quite popular for a while, sort of gone a bit out of fashion. Or is there something objective that would make our lives go well? For example, through having friendships, through having children, through achieving things in the world. Those types of things would be missing in the experience machine. They might be missing too if we all had this blissful existence on the island. On a totally personal level, I'm inclined to think that there is much that we gain from adversity and from challenge, and that although it's good to avoid suffering, that actually we learn huge amounts from suffering, certainly as health professionals, as somebody encountering suffering. I think although there's much that we want to do to alleviate suffering, actually recognizing the value of at least a certain amount of suffering in our lives might give us a different view about what makes for a good life. You've got a follow-on comment to that.
Are you talking about the concept of striving?
So it might be something to do with striving. So one of I've got another paper if people are interested in going to look it up called I can't remember what it exactly was called. Something about it's about a Japanese concept called wabi-sabi. So yes, absolutely. So it's about recognizing the value, the beauty in imperfection, in aging, and it's a very unfashionable in the world in which we live, where actually we're wanting to achieve perfection and eliminate all suffering. But I think there's great wisdom and well-being to be found in both recognizing the limits of our body and in embracing some of that imperfection. So if people are interested, you can go and look for that.
Sorry, it's not a question, but a comment to say thank you, to make an ethic lecture very interesting. Before it starts, we were talking with a couple of young minds here, and we were guessing which sort of topic you're going to touch base, and you ticked all of them. And the other part of thank you comment is that I am working on trying to send a message out there when we are talking about possibility of adverse events. It can actually happen. Now I'm thinking about a wider perspective, and I can say it's scary, but it's good. Now you gave me a fruit for thought. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a perfect way to end a stupendous night, Dominic. It just so yeah. Thank you so much. It does make us realise what a tiny, tiny speck we are on the time continuum. It just leaves me to thank you for your presentation. I'm sure everyone's going to walk away from here and it's minds of it, and it's going to lead on to a lot longer discussions around the coffee table as well. Thank you for all of you for attending. I think you all agree what a wonderful lecture that was, and we look forward to seeing you again at next year's lecture in 2026. Thank you.